So anyway, I want to thank everyone so much for attending today. We're really excited about this topic. For myself, this subject is one that's really near and dear to my heart. So really excited that we're getting to explore this together today. Actually, before we do that, let me double check, make sure we have the recorder on.
It was, yeah.
There we go. Okay. So before we go into the heart of our discussion today, I want to begin with a blessing for Torah study to inaugurate our time together. Baruch Beor Ha'olam. Blessed is the light of the world that brings us to this moment. May all of us be ready to wrestle with Torah, and may we all be blessed with peace, loving kindness, and curiosity. Amen. Today's seminar is intended to provide an introduction to the subject of Jewish conscientious objection over 3 sessions. The first will be looking at the past, the history of conscientious objection in Judaism and in the broader society. Our second session will be looking at the theology and philosophy of conscientious objection, particularly looking at one particular Torah passage that is at the heart of a lot of the conversation. And finally, in the third section, we'll be looking at our present moment as well as the future, especially asking a question about how Jewish and Jewish adjacent people can best be ready to support conscientious objection, with a special focus on the issues facing Jews in the United States and Israel. Before we go on, just a few housekeeping issues. Just a reminder on Zoom to go ahead and please have your Zoom muted if you're not speaking. But please feel free to use the chat. I will be monitoring the chat. My life partner is here with me today, and she's going to be monitoring the chat. So if there's any good things that maybe along the way you think, oh, James, you should mention this, put it in the chat, and I will check it periodically. We also will have time at the end of each hour for a quick comfort break, but also some discussion time. And finally, in our third session, we're going to have some extended discussion time, which we may or may not do in breakout groups, depending on how many folks are on at that point. But for that last session in particular, we're going to be looking at how do we take what we've learned to the next level? How do we put it into action? Also, I should mention that today we have our proverbial mixed multitude in attendance. We have folks both online and in person here in Oklahoma City. We have, and we will, of course, have folks later watching via the recordings of these programs. We also have a mix of generations, as well as a mix of Jewish and non-Jewish folks. And that is wonderful. I'm hoping that this diversity will lead to some good conversations. I'll also mention that most of this will be in lecture form. I'm not crazy about this. I wish we could do something a little more livelier, but there's just a lot of good ground to cover. We will, though, have some time for discussion and really do welcome the comments and stuff in the chat. So before we get into the heart of the content, I do want to give a quick introduction of myself. And the reason for this is simply that I think any learning opportunities help to know the biases of the presenter, to know where I'm coming from. So a little bit of my context. I've been an attorney since 2006, and I do human rights law in the area of military law, meaning that I represent members of the U.S. military as a private civilian attorney. This includes in courts-martial, administrative separation boards, military discharges, including those based on conscientious objection. And finally, I do a fair bit of First Amendment law in this context as well, helping service members know what the boundary lines of what they can and can't say while in the military. And sometimes I do have clients who come to me first for a discharge on conscientious objection grounds, but they end up later pursuing a discharge on other grounds. And that's part of this whole system. I've worked with members of the military from all branches of the military, except the Space Force, still waiting for my first one of those. And I've worked with people all across the country and around the world. And in this, I've really come to have a great, deep appreciation for the courage that members of the military face when they're willing to take the heat and do what it takes to get discharged. Outside of my legal work, though, I also serve as an interfaith officiant through the Oklahoma Objector community, and I'm part of the lay leadership team at the Spinoza Havara. By the way, this is a good time to quickly mention the folks that helped to make this program possible. That includes Judaism Unbound. I'm doing this training is my capstone project for the certificate program in Unbound Judaism. So really excited to have their support today, especially getting the word out to so many new people. Also want to thank the Spinoza Havara, a humanistic Jewish congregation that's allowing me the use of their Zoom today. Joy Mennonite Church in Oklahoma City. And this is a very special place. I'm having this for the in-person folks. This was actually during the 1960s and 70s. This was a location for alternative service where people who were drafted, who are doing their alternative service in lieu of being drafted, where they lived, working in inner city schools, working in hospitals, doing incredible work during that time period. So I'm very honored to get text. And finally, which has shared some of the information. And someone said that okay, maybe it looked like the screen was locked. Was everyone able to still hear me okay?
You were coming in and out, but you're back now, it seems.
Okay, I'm going to double check a couple things real fast before we go on, just make sure I don't have anything that's slowing the computer down. This is always the trick on Zoom stuff. Okay, we'll keep going for now, but please feel free to put it in the chat if there's problems with the audio. Or lastly, though, before we delve into just to give a couple of quick disclaimers, especially those of you watching later and recorded. First of all, this presentation is general in nature and is not a substitute for particularized legal advice. In other words, if you're a service member facing legal questions, you do need to talk to the GI Rights Hotline or to a qualified attorney in this area. Secondly, I am not an expert on Jewish law, particularly from a traditional perspective. I'm going to give lots of opinions about Jewish law, but it's coming from my very amateur perspective. Also, I should tell you that I'm very firmly in the humanistic/reform camp, which means I approach halakha from a perspective of individual choice, not as being universally binding. I do hope a lot of this presentation will be of interest to halakhically minded Jews as well, but I do want to make it clear that that's my perspective. Finally, I am limited a little bit on perspective just due to time. We're focusing primarily on the situation in the US and Israel. These issues do come up for Jews in other parts of the world, but we won't be able to delve into them as deeply just because of time constraints. Finally, I want to give a quick glossary of terms that will help us for the rest of today's seminar. These terms are ones that are really important to understand because they really guide us in our thinking. The first term is the word conscientious objector. Conscientious objector is a legal term that refers to those who are morally opposed to all wars on the basis of conscience. In the past, it was always framed religiously, but today, current case law and statutes in the U.S. have made it clear that non-religious folks can qualify as well, if their moral values have the same level of depth as those of religious folks. So that's who a conscientious objector is. By the way, you sometimes hear the term used in other contexts outside of war, such in medical contexts and other places. Today, we're just talking about conscientious objection to war. Our second term is selective CO, selective conscientious objector. That refers to someone who is opposed to some wars for reasons of conscience, but not all wars. Selective COs are not currently recognized under U.S. law, but it is an important concept that will come up in our later conversations. The third term is the word war resistor. This is a term that is used to describe those who resist a particular war, often for political, philosophical, or other reasons. Some war resistors might also qualify as COs if they are morally opposed to all wars. But some war resistors refuse to seek the status due to their objection to participation in the machinery of the draft itself. Another term is civil disobedience. By civil disobedience, I'm referring to simply the intentional breaking of unjust laws for the sake of conscience. Another word, a pejorative term, but one that we need to know about because it comes up a lot, and that is the word draft dodger. This imprecise and heavily debated term normally refers to men who have found ways to avoid being drafted, most often through the use of legal exemptions, but also sometimes by going underground or by seeking refuge in third countries, including Canada and Sweden. I personally prefer the less pejorative term of draft resistor to refer to those who are resisting the draft itself. Finally, the last term we need to define is draft registration resistor. These are men who have refused to register for the draft. A small number were imprisoned in the 1980s for this, but many more suffer other collateral consequences of refusing to register. I would love to get into this topic more today. We won't have time to talk much about draft registration resistors today, but just want to mention that is another concept that's in the mix here. Okay, so we got our glossary out of the way. Now let's get into the history. Now, for the history of conscientious objection, we have one problem. The obvious place we want to go as Jews is to Torah, the Tanakh, the Jewish scriptures. The problem is that Torah, or Tanakh in general, is a mix of things, including history, but also mythic legends and stories. And it's always hard to tell what is history, what is not history. So, since we're going to be discussing the biblical text in more details in the second hour, I'm not going to talk about the biblical times from a historical lens, except I do want to read one verse because it's going to come up again and again in later conversations. And this gives us a framing from the biblical times, what this concept was rooted in. And this comes from Deuteronomy 20, verse 8. And this was, by the way, a little bit of context right before this. They're giving instructions under the Mosaic rules about what would be the exemptions for a draft, and includes if you've just been married, if you've just planted a vineyard, if you've just built a house. The fourth one was, and it specifically says, the official shall go on addressing the troops and say, quote, is there anyone afraid and disheartened? Let him go back to his home, lest the courage of his comrades flag like his. So keep that verse in mind. It's going to come up again and again. But that's all we're going to say about biblical times right now. The next bit of history, though, we want to pick up instead is the Maccabean War. So in the Maccabean War, quick little context, folks who may not be familiar with this. Chronologically, this happened. Remember, the nation of southern kingdom of Judah was sent into captivity, with the elite being sent into Babylon. About 70 or so years later, some of them were allowed to return under Emperor Cyrus of Persia back to rebuild the temple, to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. And then they operated semi-autonomously under the Persian Empire. But then the Greeks came. And then there was some tension, and eventually the Greeks started demanding more and more and more as far as loyalty from the Jewish community. And eventually that led to the Maccabean Revolt. So the important thing about the Maccabean Revolt as it relates to conscientious objection is that in the book of First Maccabees, in chapter 3, verse 56, we see Judas Maccabee, who's being depicted, by the way, throughout the book of Maccabees as being the model biblical warrior. So this is what it says in 356. Quote, in keeping with the law, he told all who were building houses or who were about to get married or planting a vineyard or were faint-hearted to go home. So this is directly quoting from this idea back in Deuteronomy. In First Maccabees, it's understood this needs to happen. However, we know from history his successor, Jonathan Maccabee, undid these exemptions from conscription. So this was a brief period that we do see this was carried out. So now we jump ahead a little bit to the Roman Empire. During the days of the Roman Empire, Jews were often granted exemptions from conscriptions, particularly in the early days of the empire, often due to the unusual scruples of Jews regarding marching behind imperial imagery. But these exemptions were not universal in scope, intended to either be extended to individual communities or to individual people. Because of this, and because of the inconsistency, many Jews did serve in the Roman military. That is, until the 5th century CE, when Jews were banned from service by Christian Emperor Theodosius II. And this prohibition became the norm throughout the succeeding centuries throughout Europe. At times, of course, Jews were still allowed to serve in the military, but most often not. And the reason for this is that, and particularly we're now moving into the medieval era during this time in Europe, that Jews were not treated as citizens of the lands they lived in, but were often treated as outsiders. And because of this, they were denied all of the privileges and also some of the obligations of citizenship, including serving in the military. This began to shift quite a bit, though. during the Enlightenment. This was a time in European history when people were asking lots of questions and ideas of citizenship and nationalism were evolving. And so because of that, Jews began to be subjected to conscription. By the way, I'm going to mention in passing something really important, and you'll notice in this history, I focused, unfortunately, mostly on the history of Ashkenazi Jews, particularly from the Roman Empire onward. And that's because I found very little so far on these issues in Sephardic and Mizrahi communities during this time period. So this is an area I'm really hoping to get to dig more into in the future. But unfortunately, I don't know as much about that, so we'll not be showing about that today. So then we need to jump across the pond to the Americas, where a different type of society was brewing, which led, of course, to the U.S. American Revolution, but also led to revolutions throughout the Americas. Jews were present in several places throughout the Americas, including in colonial North America, but they were a fairly small part of society. And so from this part of the history onward, I'm now going to shift gears a little bit. We're going to delve a little bit more into some of the secular history, particularly from the U.S. side, but we're going to be coming back along the ways to how Jews were treated during these times. Real quick, though, before we go on, I'm going to jump over to the chat real quick and see if there's any good stuff over there. So I have one comment from Lex who said that's really interesting. There's a need to measure if secular/non-religious views are held as sincerely as religious values in order to determine if one is a conscientious objector. Absolutely. In fact, I would argue in some ways that the military standards on this, in some ways, or government standards, have really evolved in some ways to recognize a kind of secular spirituality. The idea of that people might have higher values that function in a way very similar to religious folks. We also had other comments. One person mentioned the fact that there were military recruiters on their high school campus, and then conversations about ROTC. There's so much good stuff here. So thank you. Keep the comments coming. Okay, so let's continue on with our history. During the Revolutionary War era, there was not a nationwide draft on the U.S. side. However, states sometimes administered their own drafts, often through militias, but often convened with very short terms of service. Jews did serve in the military during the Revolutionary War. I haven't found any evidence that there was any conscientious objection or anything like that from the Jewish community during the Revolutionary War era. We now jump ahead to the War of 1812, a war that in U.S. history tends to be given short notice. It's seen as a minor war. However, we always forget here in the U.S. that the War of 1812 was in many ways Canada's War of Independence, of establishing their autonomy from the U.S., but also that Washington, D.C. was burned and sacked by the British. That's what level of an existential threat the War of 1812 was for the U.S. Despite that, guess what? There was no draft called during the War of 1812. The president wanted one, but it got shot down in Congress, primarily due to the leadership of Congressman Daniel Webster. So now we jump ahead in history some more to the Civil War, the U.S. Civil War. And during this time, a lot happened that would shape history as it relates to conscription in the times to come. Drafts were called in both the North and South, but followed the previous pattern of mostly being implemented by the states. There was significant unrest and conflict over the draft. There was widespread evasion, but there was also rioting, which unfortunately sometimes became unfortunately racially based rioting, often by Northern opponents of the draft who blamed African Americans for the Civil War, bizarrely enough. That was literally the reason for the riots in New York City during the Civil War. Despite all this, though, there was a lot of complicated feelings about conscription, one being Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, he opposed the draft in 1865. Bear in mind, that was the last year of the Civil War. This is what he said. What is freedom? It is the right to choose one's own employment. Certainly it means that if it means anything. And when any individual or combination of individuals undertakes to decide for any man when he shall work, where he shall work, at what he shall work, and for what he shall work, he or they practically reduce him to slavery. This is Frederick Douglass saying this. And I think this is important. I've heard times people have said, It's inappropriate to compare the draft to slavery. Well, Frederick Douglass didn't think so. He saw the connection. I will mention too, though, that draft laws in both the North and South allowed for some limited exemptions, but they also specifically allowed. Sorry, we have a fly in here that's causing all kinds of problems. Um, but also specifically, the draft in the Civil War era allowed for people to pay someone else to serve in their place, literally making the Civil War the proverbial rich man's war, poor man's fight. The rich man gets the credit, poor man are the people that actually have to do the fight. Also, though, I mentioned that as for Jews in the Civil War, we were involved in both sides of the conflict, but with greater numbers in the North than in the South. But I haven't found any sources thus far that discuss the issue of conscientious objection during this time in the Jewish community. The conversation, I'm sure, happened, but so far I haven't found the evidence of it. So now we jump ahead now to World War I. This was the first time the United States held a nationwide federally administered draft. This draft was wildly unpopular in many places, but especially in my home state of Oklahoma, where there was actually an armed rebellion against the draft called the Green Corn Rebellion, which happened in August of 1917, 108 years ago as of this month. This rebellion was a triracial movement of poor white people, Black people, and Native Americans who saw the draft as a tool of oppression by the rich. This rebellion was quickly shot down, leading to a time of terror in Oklahoma in which leftists of all stripes, but also religious pacifists who weren't involved in the rebellion, were targeted. To give a small taste of the revolutionary spirit that the draft sparked, I have one short reading to share. This is of an elderly Seminole Muskogee Creek woman who relayed this to author Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz about her uncle that had been imprisoned after the rebellion. And here's what she said. The full moon of late July, early August it was, the moon of the green corn. It was not easy to persuade our poor white and Black brothers and sisters to rise up. We told them that rising up, standing up, whatever the consequences, would inspire future generations. Our courage, our bravery would be remembered and copied. That has been the Indian way for centuries since the invasions. Fight and tell the stories that those who come after or their descendants will rise up again. It may take 1,000 years, but that is how we continue and eventually prevail. Now, I share this story about the Green Corn Rebellion for a couple of reasons. One, just to show how unpopular the draft was, but also to show that draft resistance looks like many things and often is motivated by things besides purely conscientious objection. The participants in the Green Corn Rebellion were not opposed to the use of violence against their rich oppressors. They were opposed to the use of violence for a war that they had no part in. And so I bring this up to say that draft resistance itself can look like many things. It doesn't, and again, there are people who have pushed back against the draft who were not pacifists even. Now, another thing to look at during the Civil War, though, is how exemptions functioned. Buying one's way out. By the way, we're having hilarious. This fly is just causing all kinds of mayhem here. I'm so sorry. Anyway, buying one's way out was banned. Instead, all decisions were made by local drafts, which is a positive compared to how it was in the Civil War. The problem was that these draft boards tended to call up poor men because they saw them as unskilled and not needed at home. In other words, if you were a skilled laborer, if you had an education, you were much more likely to get that exemption than a poor, unskilled person. That said, many sought exemptions, often based on economic reasons or due to family hardship. In fact, I found out in researching my family tree that 3 of my 4 ancestors who were of draft age during World War I sought exemptions from the draft. And that blew me away. I thought maybe one of them, but to have 3 out of the 4 that do so was pretty extraordinary. Now, also, what about conscience in these days? How is conscientious objection handled by the system? Well, unfortunately, the World War I era draft laws only recognize claims by a limited number of religious traditions. But even these exemptions were often disallowed by local draft boards. So, where were the Jews in these debates? Well, in the UK, which had a much longer involvement in the war, major Jewish institutions largely supported conscription. but many individual Jews and some leaders opposed it, some with who faced severe consequences for refusing induction or for supporting conscientious objectors. As for the United States, I haven't found anything written about draft resistance in the Jewish community during World War I. But I did find a 1917 resolution by the CCAR, that is the Rabbinic Association of the Reform Movement, which took a very hostile position towards conscientious objection in 1917. And by the way, we'll hear some later statements by the CCAR later that are very different. 1917, everyone went bonkers. You start after World War I, we see a much better position from the Jewish community. But this is what we heard in 1917. Quote, "Well, the mission of Israel is peace, yet when one's country is at war in behalf of righteousness and humanity, the individual Jew who claims this hope of Judaism as a ground of exemption from military service does so only as an individual, inasmuch as historic Judaism emphasizes patriotism as a duty, as well as the ideal of peace." Now, my question is, why did the CCAR feel the need to make this statement? I really am curious about that. And it makes me wonder if there was pushback against the draft in Jewish circles. But anyway, it's a question for future research. So now we move to a very interesting period of time, which is the inter-World War era years. During this time, conscription was off the table in the United States. There was no more draft. However, there was still a legal issue, and that was that U.S. immigration law said that anyone who was becoming naturalized as a U.S. citizen, any immigrant who came here wants to become a U.S. citizen, must be, when they swear their oath, they're required to say that they would be willing to fight, to bear arms in defense of this country if called upon. Because of this, many Jews did speak out in opposition to this law. And again, this was a time, for a brief period of time, there was still a lot of Jewish migration. 1920s, that was largely cut off. But despite that, there was still some Jews still coming, and so these issues were very, very much on the table. And so looking at what the institutional Jewish world did, we see in 1929 and in 1930, we have statements from the CCAR that called for the U.S. government to not bar immigrants from naturalization who would refuse to bear arms in defense of the nation. In 1931, the CCAR said, quote, "It is in accord with the highest interpretation of Judaism for a Jew to conscientiously object to personal participation in warfare. We oppose any legislation designed to penalize adherents of any religion who conscientiously object to personally engaging in military operation," unquote. Now think about this. What a striking difference we have between 1917 and 1931. Same organization, but very different position. Finally, in 1932 and in 1936, the CCAR made statements in defense of the rights of Jewish COs to be recognized alongside those of the traditional peace churches. One issue that was becoming more and more of an issue was the government was still locked into this idea that you had to be part of a recognized peace church to be a CO, and that if you were part of a tradition that did not have a universal peace position, you could not be a CO. The Jewish community was calling for this change to be pushed, for this to be undone, and calling not only for Jewish COs, but COs from other traditions that had a more mixed record on conscientious objection, for those people to still be eligible for the status. So now we jump ahead to World War II. During World War II, we saw massive social changes, and we especially saw different dynamic because this was a war that was backed by the public in ways that World War I never was. Hence, there's popular support for conscription even before the U.S. entered the war. In fact, that's part of the reason why our current system, the selective service system, was created in 1940, a year before the start of U.S. involvement in the war. And there were some positive changes made with the creation of this system. Unfortunately, when you create a system like this, it's always there. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. Now, despite the fact there being some better concessions, there is still a lot of resistance to this system. From what we know, about 4% of those drafted refused to show up. They evaded it, with a very small number of those eventually being prosecuted. We also know that 72,000 men applied for CO status in the U.S. during World War II. Of those number, the majority, 52,000, received the status. with about 25,000 of those going into the military in non-combatant roles, doing duties such as being a medic or things like that. 12,000 of them went to the civilian public service program. But of those who were rejected as COs, nearly 6,000 went to prison. So then, oh, also, just jumping in, Lex, you said your grandpa was one. Was he a, tell us real quick about him.
So I don't know all the specifics of his situation, but I do know that he objected, and I mean he was born in 1923, and so his age would have put him squarely in who would go to World War II. And I know he objected, and I know he was socialist, and I don't know if he would have called himself a pacifist or what his precise like thinking was, but I think that he leaned that direction, and he did conscientiously object.
Excellent, excellent. And I would love to, if any of y'all have stories like that, please put them in the chat. Would love to hear about them. And I know there's many stories along these lines. And we
But
also,
for importantly for this conversation, he was not like religious. He wouldn't have cited Jewish texts
sure.
on it, which is a bummer because it'd be great material. But yeah.
Well, and that's a good point. At this moment in time in World War, kind of conscientious objection allowed was religious CO. That's going to change during the Vietnam War, but right now we're still stuck in the model that it is only a conscientious objection. Now, talking about Jewish involvement in World War II, many Jews, of course, did participate in the war, but a small number sought exemption as COs or refused induction. In response to this, in 1941, Jewish Peace Fellowship was formed. And this is their description is, quote, to support Jewish conscientious objectors to the military, to help educate local draft boards accustomed only to Christian writs of conscientious objection, of the theological basis of the Jewish position on conscientious objection, grounded in Torah, Talmud, and other sacred and religious texts, unquote. So the formation of JPF at this time led to deeper, increased Jewish involvement with other religiously oriented peace organizations, which set the stage for the future, particularly the massive buildup of support for draft resistors during the Vietnam War. Now, besides the formation of JPF, we also saw some degree of support from some degree of support for conscientious objectors by mainstream Jewish organizations. A few examples I found, I'm sure there's more out there, but this is what I found, was in the CCAR in 1940 and also 1942 called for continued respect for the rights of COs, including those from minority traditions. And then after the war, in 1946 and again in 1956, CCAR called for removal of all sanctions on those who were previously imprisoned for refusing to comply with the draft. In other words, we mentioned earlier, 6,000 men were imprisoned during World War II for refusing to fight. The CCAR, after the war, in two different statements, called for those people, for all the penalties against them, their previous felony conviction and all that, to be taken away. So a really remarkable thing, what CCAR was doing. And again, we're seeing a real tide of a change. Again, looking back to 1917, where the CCAR is at, now this is 40 years later, 30 and 40 years later, very, very different position. So now moving forward, we come to the Korean War and the Cold War era peacetime draft. And this, what I mean by this is the draft effectively stayed in place about the time of the Korean War onward, all the way through the Vietnam War. So we had a big chunk of time, we had a peacetime draft, where that some men were drafted, even though there wasn't necessarily a war going on, except, of course, during Korea. But during this time, there's also some things happen on the legal front, some changes in the rules. One is that the paternity exemption for married men was removed. For a time, if you had children, you were exempted from the draft. That went away. The exemption for college students was added, but it applied only to the current semester, allowing someone to finish their current semester. Also, a doctor's draft was created during this time, which medical doctors who are past the traditional draft age. Remember, doctors are in school forever, so they would never be subject to a regular draft, but they were being drafted later. And a good example of this, a lot of familiar who are my age and older remember the TV show MASH. And one of my favorite characters was Major Winchester, a pompous blowhard who was constantly offended that he was having to work in this filthy mobile army surgical hospital, and he should be the chief surgeon at some highfalutin hospital in Boston. He was a fascinating, fun character, but he was an example of this doctor's draft. Now, during this time, there continued to be a small number of Jewish COs and draft resistors during the Korean War. Unfortunately, I found very little about this history. I have found, though, that the Murray Polner papers at Bryn Mawr College has some materials on this. So I have not made it there yet. Someday I hope to read their materials. But there were some Jewish COs during this era. Finally, we get to the Vietnam War, and this is where things get really interesting. The Vietnam War, much like World War I, was wildly popular, particularly among young adults. Resistance took many forms, including overt actions such as burning of draft cards, going underground in the USA, fleeing to other countries. But there was also a groundswell of organizing by ordinary people of all walks of life to be trained as draft counselors. The end result is that many draftees were able to escape the draft. Some did alternative service as COs. Some went to prison. Some found other forms of exemption. Some did non-combatant service in the military. And so now let's go ahead and now jump over to the Jewish story again. Let's see how the Jewish community dealt with things in the Vietnam era. And for this, we're very lucky. We have a lot of documentary evidence of what happened during this era. So I have a few things to share from starting with 1969. The Rabbinic Council of America, which was the largest Orthodox rabbinic association, they condemned the burning of draft cards in 1969 as, quote, a clear violation of the basic process of democracy. The same year, though, the conservative movement's United Synagogue Youth Convention, quote, voiced opposition to draft because of Vietnam conflict and asked Jewish agencies and rabbis to offer direct counseling on military service, conscientious objection, and pacifism. We also, during this time in 1969, we have the case of John Scott Ruskay. He was a JTSA student who was denied his CO claim by his draft board because a draft board member said, quote, Jews can't be COs. And this would come up again and again. The problem is that for many draft boards, they wanted to try to say that all that matters is your religious affiliation. If your religion isn't on record as being a peace church, you can't be a CO. This is not true. And a lot of case law since then has clarified that. We also, in 1970, the Synagogue Council, which represented Reformed, Conservative, and Orthodox Jewish organizations, issued a statement calling for equal treatment of Jews in draft boards, saying that CO can be a legitimate Jewish position. Also in 1970, the CCAR asked affiliated congregations to, quote, support college student Vietnam protests, asserting right to petition for redress of grievances is fundamental to the democratic process. Also in 1970, Hadassah, the Zionist sisterhood organization, quote, expressed support for responsible opinion in favor of right to dissent and for speedy end to the Vietnam War and Arab War against Israel. That was 1970. Finally, in 1970, the B'nai B'rith Hillel Foundations, quote, asserted right and obligation of campus chaplains to counsel students on conscientious objection and the draft. There were many, many Jews who found ways to resist the draft. To provide an example of the thinking that animated some of these Jewish COs and resistors, I'm going to read a short excerpt from the book, Wrestling with Conscience, a guide for Jewish draft registrants and conscientious objectors. And this passage was written by an anonymous Jewish young adult as part of his essay for his CO application packet. The process by which I arrived at the beliefs which I now hold was a continuous development, and to a certain extent, I feel that they have always been a part of my life. I grew up in a house where the values of human dignity and equality were always emphasized. My parents have always worked, each in their own way, to further the causes of human freedom and brotherhood. They are probably the most important influences on me in my early life, especially my father, a lawyer concerned with civil rights and equal opportunity. My early religious training in the Jewish tradition was also important, particularly since the educators and rabbis with whom I came into contact through my participation in Jewish youth groups were very much concerned with problems of interfaith and interracial understanding and cooperation. Although I am no longer a practicing member of any congregation, and although I do not accept many specific tenets of Jewish theology, I continue to regard myself as Jewish. I would align myself with those ancient and modern Jewish thinkers who have held that the true basis of Jewish faith is adherence to the law. Quote, what is hateful to thee, do not do to thy fellow man, unquote. I believe that the humanistic tradition of Judaism, with its emphasis on brotherhood and the dignity of the individual, supports me in my beliefs and in my opposition to war. Martin Buber, a great contemporary Jewish theologian, has said, quote, no one who counts himself in the ranks of Israel can desire to use force, unquote. I believe that. So I give that as just one of many examples of the ways that Jewish conscientious objectors framed their beliefs in those days. By the way, in the and Lex, I'm so glad you clicked, because I was wondering if it was the same John Ruskay. There is a Wikipedia article as mentioned in the chat. He became a leader of Jewish communal organizations, including the UUA Federation of New York. So just a reminder to folks who might be nervous about conscientious objection and what it might mean to someone in their long-term life. At least he's someone who took his experience and he continued to be involved Jewishly for the rest of his life. Okay, so now we've covered a lot of ground, but we now need to talk about what happened after the Vietnam War. At first, the draft went away, yay! But then the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and that led to the resumption of draft registration under President Jimmy Carter. This also led to some early prosecutions of resistors, of draft registration resistors, including of my friend Ed Hasbrook, who ended up doing some time in federal prison. And I do know there were some Jewish draft registration resistors as well. So I'm hoping in the future we'll know more about their stories. So this is a time period that basically happened. There was no more draft, but it required all young men at age 18 to register. And there were a fair number of young men who said, no, I'm not going to register. And so this is the dynamic we're now under. So looking at what the institutional Jewish world did, we do see a few statements in the early 1980s. In 1980, CCAR issued a statement calling for respect for conscientious objectors if a draft was called again. 1981, the Reconstructionist Rabbinic Association made a statement calling for respect of COs, including even selective objectors. In other words, those who are opposed to some wars but not all wars. 1982, the CCAR called for an end to draft registration and opposed the draft more generally. This is important, and one thing I've wondered, I have not found any statements from the CCAR on this subject since 1982. I wonder why, and what we can do to get them and other organizations like this to still see this as a serious issue. But right now, it hasn't been touched since 1982. Also worth noting, though, is during this time, this post-Vietnam era, there's a time where while the draft was no longer in operation, there were a growing number of service members, including active duty and reserves, who were being discharged on the grounds of CO. Others, especially during the Gulf War, Iraq War, Afghanistan War, and related conflicts, have engaged in acts of war resistance, including the step of fleeing to other countries to seek asylum. I'm not aware of Jewish people who are resistors during this era, but there were many Jewish people involved in the support of these resistors. So now it brings us to today. Before we do that, let me jump over. I think there's a few things in chat that might be good to look at.
Unitarian Universalists. It's the second book.
So we have Trey shared. I'm intrigued by the manners in which other theologically progressive faith bodies embraced and wrestled with the concept of peacemaking and conscientious objection. One such group is the Unitarian Universalist Association, which adopted a statement of conscience regarding the topic in the 2010s. That's awesome. For UUs, a statement of conscience. As close to a policy statement as the association provides, and link to that in the chat. Also, so the other thing is someone asked, is the Carter Instituted draft the same as, so yes, so what Carter did was he started the selective service up again. So the selective service was put on ice at the end of the Vietnam War, or the US involvement in the Vietnam War. Carter brought it back. Now, he did not bring back a draft, so we haven't had a draft since the Vietnam War. What we have had is the ongoing obligation of draft registration. And so that brings us to our present moment in time. Today, there are very few prosecutions of those who refuse to register for the draft, but instead the Selective Service seeks to use coercion and trickery to get as many young people as possible to be registered. By the way, this includes undocumented men, ironically. One of the even greater tragedies here is I'm deeply concerned with for undocumented people who do register. What's to stop the Selective Service from sharing their contact info with ICE? It's a dreadful situation that by law, though if you don't register for the draft, if you're unlawfully present in the US as a male between the ages of 18 and 26, you have an obligation to register for the draft, even though you're not a US citizen, even though you're not even lawfully present here. If later you even leave the country, you come back, you try to seek status in the future, if you did not register between the ages of 18 and 26, you can't register, and therefore you can't ever get your status. It's a rotten, rotten situation, what we've done for undocumented people as it relates to the Selective Service. Other issues related to the Selective Service in that it's currently understaffed. It does not, and it also specifically does not have enough people sitting on local draft boards. One thing folks don't know is the Selective Service Administration not only takes those cards he'll mail in or do the online thing, but also they have local draft boards established. However, many of those draft boards don't have enough members. And so if they tried calling a draft in the future, unless Congress changed the rules, they would have a very difficult time actually doing a draft. I do think, though, that how the government would do this in the future is they wouldn't even use the draft registrations. They would instead use commercial databases, maybe IRS tax data. So there's some serious concerns there. Another issue is whether women could be drafted. Until very recently, many of us believe from a legal analysis that women being subjected to the draft was almost inevitable, given how the court was ruling on cases involving gender discrimination, and particularly since women were now being allowed to perform all combat related roles. The Supreme Court punted the issue a few years ago, refused to take up the case, and it looks like under the current administration, that's pretty unlikely. However, I do think one area that I think might be an exception where women could still be at more risk of being drafted is a special skills draft. And this would be for people with medical skills or other technical professions. I do think that for women, I think there is a much higher risk in those fields compared to other fields. But as far as a general draft of women, that's pretty unlikely at this moment. That could change. Finally, and where I'm most concerned with what's really driving force for this presentation is, while the Selective Service isn't ready for draft, neither is the peace community. The infrastructure needed to have quality draft counseling, assisting young people maybe facing these questions, just doesn't really exist right now, and that's a real concern. Okay, so we now are at a time for a few minutes of discussion. So we'll open that up for about 6 minutes. Feel free to unmute yourself if if you have a question or comment. And then after that, we'll take a quick comfort break before we jump into our next session. So feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions, comments, etc.
I don't know yet if it's a comment or question, but the John Ruskay thing I think is really interesting because I put in the chat, he went on to be a leader of UJA Federation in New York. There's actually like a leadership thing named after him. And of course, as part of that, that means he was presiding over a lot of aid and advocating for like support for Israeli violence. And I don't know whether this is a question or just a noticing. I think it's interesting to notice somebody who played such a key role in objecting to violence in one respect, having a different role in another respect. I don't bring that up to like throw shade at him. I just think it's like a layered legacy and points to some interesting dynamics Jewishly.
Absolutely. By the way, in the chat, one thing I'll read. Jamie posted, I think in Canada, there's not been any draft since World War II, completely voluntary. And I think Canada is a great example of, in many ways, a society with a lot of similarities to the United States, but has chosen a very different path culturally since World War II. It is interesting how I would be really curious how the conversations about these issues have changed. I'd be really curious how Jews in Canada in the 1960s and 70s were talking about issues of peace and war compared to Jews in the United States, whether the threat of you or your children being drafted change the dynamics or not. I don't know. It's a great question. Well, I think we're going to go and take a quick comfort break. So we'll come back at the top of the hour. If you have any questions, comments in the meantime, go ahead and put them in the chat, and I'll be back at the top of the hour for our next section, which will be delving into some Jewish text and what they say about this subject. So we'll be back in just a moment.